We'll begin by sitting together for about a half an hour so you can get yourselves settled into a comfortable enough posture for that. If you want, you can take a couple of deep breaths just to gently invite the system to settle. We're not making any demands, but just trusting that our nervous systems know what to do. We can remember that awareness is natural. We might need to remember to be aware, but there's this natural capacity of the mind for connection. So more than demanding anything, making anything happen, we're just remembering to trust what's natural, even if we have to keep remembering to trust it again and again and again. And part of the remembering is remembering embodied awareness, remembering that there is a body. And all of us, in some way, we know that. Awareness can be very light, a light knowing of the body, really from the periphery. Or it can be more precise, more specific, really landing somewhere, like on the breath. To see what the most accessible way is for you to know that there's a body. And if there's any ease when we don't make demands, but just learn to trust, just really take that in. We know ourselves, we know this world through this body, through embodiment. So it's always relevant. And trusting means that we're also willing to make adjustments. Sometimes we might feel like, oh, that's too much. And maybe the right move is to lighten up a bit, expand the breath of awareness, maybe even open the eyes a bit. What makes it easier, more accessible? What makes awareness easier, more accessible? Can also move back and forth between feeling the body and noticing sound. Sound is only available through the body anyway. It just sometimes makes embodiment a little more accessible. Not so much going out and trying to find the right sound or a good sound, but just the simple recognition that the ears are receiving sound. Awareness practice can be accessible to all of us. Just have to be willing to adjust to find our way. And as we go along, trusting awareness, the mind will pick up on more subtleties of our experience. Like wanting something to happen, or wanting to avoid something. Maybe we feel a bit restless, the energy is elevated, or the opposite, a little sluggish. These experiences, mind experiences, color what we're noticing, how we're noticing, what it feels like to be a human being, what it feels like to have a body. Often we don't know it, but we're experiencing life, the world, through the lens of the hindrances. And of course, sometimes there's confusion, just not being clear, not even really knowing what's happening, if I'm doing it right. Most of the time, we'll get swept away by these hindrances. We won't even know it. It will just be the color of our experience. And the good news is that we don't have to stop practicing. We just keep trusting awareness. Something will reveal itself. We'll learn something. Can keep it really simple. Just remember that there's a body. Remember to find the most accessible way to the present moment. Make adjustments. Feel what's here to be felt. And if the practice gets more subtle and we start to notice more of the mind, then that's great. And if all we do is cultivate a good foundation, some stability, this very simple, trusting willingness of the heart to connect with the body, that's good too. A willingness to make adjustments, that's good too. Just do the best that you can and let that be good enough. And continue in silence now.
Yeah, the meditation.
Not only dabble the cards, put them back in your pocket.
Ready to take a minute to stretch your legs if you'd like. It's good to be here with you all. Thanks for having me. Mark will be back next week. I know you probably all got an email from him today reminding you all that he's away this week. Hear me? How's that? Thanks. So week 3, as I understand it, last week talked about the precepts. All right. This week onto the hindrances and the gradual path. Yeah, so I read a little bit of the material that Mark had sent out the last couple of weeks, and including the chapter that from Lee Brasington's book, which I didn't even know there was a book. I didn't even know he wrote a book. So that was wonderful. A year ago. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. I'll read a little bit from it tonight. But just to see, has anybody heard a talk on the hindrances before? Raise your hand. Most people, yeah. Zoomers, you heard a talk? Yeah, all the hands. Great. Not all the hands, some of the hands. It's a very common topic, right? Primarily, I think, because it's so relevant. And topic, usually there's a talk on the hindrances at most retreats. If you go to a 7-day retreat or a 9-day retreat or longer, you're going to hear a talk on the hindrances. It's a part of how you'll hear teachers in a community Dharma center like this will talk through the hindrances almost every week that we teach, because they're ever present friends. Let's call them friends, right? Hindrances as friends. Well, we learn how to relate to them as friends, right? Because we learn the hard way that relating to them as enemies doesn't really help. And once we can learn to appreciate just the learning that can happen with the hindrances, then it becomes, at least for me, I can speak for myself, the relationship to the hindrances becomes far more friendly, right? It feels the self is thinner the more we practice, gets thinner the more we practice with the hindrances, right? And what I mean by that is we take them less personally. And it's interesting because here in the United States, you might hear it, if you've been on a retreat, you might hear a talk on the hindrances about day 2 or 3 into the retreat. And that's pretty early, but the hindrances are really prolific at that time. So I think teachers, we tend to try to time it just right to get in there when they're really popping. Yeah. And yet when we study like the gradual path or the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the hindrances come quite a bit later, right? And I think because we need a fair amount of steadiness of mind to not be pulled around by them. So most of the time, we are just one with the hindrances. The hindrances that we are in our lives through the lens of one of the hindrances. Right? We don't notice that, oh, this is the hindrance of wanting. We just say, I want, right? Or this is the hindrance of aversion. We just say, I don't like. right? It's just the way it is, right? Or I'm confused, right? Or what's wrong with me? I'm so anxious, something like that, right? Or what's wrong with me? I'm always sit down to meditate and I'm always tired. There's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with my meditation, right? That's how it goes. So to learn to recognize that the mind's just hindered, it's just colored by this experience, and there's a relationship there. There's a nature to each of the hindrances. They express themselves in a particular way, and we can get to know that. And we can learn to explore the ways in which we're relating to the hindrances themselves, right? And I hope this feels like, well, that's good news. We can learn to practice with these. Yeah, it's not the end of the road. Joseph Goldstein's instructions for working with the hindrances include these four things. One, recognize them, notice them. Two, don't act them out. It's good advice. Three, don't believe the thought, I can't practice until this passes. And four, let the hindrances reveal themselves. Let them express themselves, because that's how we'll learn about them, right? So we can learn to not act them out and learn to express themselves. We can learn to do both, right? But because we're often merged with the experience of the hindrances, we feel like we are the hindrances. That becomes tricky. So we have to learn how to do that. Okay. So in the four foundations of mindfulness, this is where the Buddha taught how to establish mindfulness. The four foundations go from gross to subtle, from the most obvious to the most refined, right? And the hindrances show up in the most refined category. So from body, mindfulness of the body, to mindfulness of feeling, to mindfulness of mind, to mindfulness of dhammas. And in this category of mindfulness of dhammas, it's really where we start to explore free suffering and the end of suffering. Starting to understand the mind as a dynamic process, set of processes. Yeah. So learning how to not so much take everything personally, but see like, oh, there's something playing out here. And this always reminds me of, if you were here on Sunday morning, you might have heard me say something about spiritual practice, because I've been thinking about like, what is spiritual practice? Why do we call this spiritual practice? And really the spiritual practice, if we think about that, it's spiritual means that we're sort of bowing to something that's very difficult to see, something that's really bigger than any one of us. And when we take things personally, our worlds get so small. And when we practice in this spiritual way, the world gets really broader, a set of dynamic processes that are playing themselves out. And they play themselves out internally in this mind and the way it is. And they play themselves out relationally in our bigger structures, systems, socially. Like the world is an expression, is animated by the forces of greed, hatred, and delusion, or by their more subtle expressions of the hindrances, right? Just like the world is animated by all the forces of good, right? The forces of love, the forces of kindness, the forces of awareness, right? Our world's animated by all of that. So when we start to see like that, this is how it is, the processes become really interesting, right? And really relevant. And so part of even taking up a study like the hindrances is knowing that what we're noticing is beyond what we normally notice. It's beyond what we're normally normally noticing, normally coming in contact with, right? Yeah. So in that way, just saying it like that, hopefully you feel like, oh yeah, I don't need to take it so personally, right? And in the fourth foundation of mindfulness, we're learning about this, understanding the mind is a dynamic process, and the process of what supports freedom and what supports more tightness, more constrictedness, a tighter, more polarized sense of self. I like that word polarized these days. Yeah. And so the 5 hindrances are often paired with the 7 factors of awakening. The 7 factors of awakening are those cultivated qualities of mind that are liberative, right? They're expansive. They bring with them a greater sense of freedom. And the hindrances are the opposite, right? They bring with them a more tight, constricted, narrowing, lived experience. So the first of the 5 hindrances is the hindrance of sensual desire. Let me back up a little bit. So we have to learn how to attend wisely to the hindrances. That's one of the ways the Buddha would instruct us. We have to learn what is wise attention, what is yaniso manasikara, if you want to use the Pali, attending wisely to the experience of a hindered mind. And how do we know when we're attending unwisely to the experience of a hindered mind? And often use the analogy of feeding and starving. So we want to know, like, okay, what's feeding the tightness, right? And what's loosening the tightness, right? What's starving the tightness? So the hindrances, we could say they're the Pali word, it means something like covering over. So the hindrances are visitors to the mind. They cover over natural wisdom. Sometimes they cover over some a deeper pattern that's there that we're not noticing, deeper patterns that are there. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So different ways that we can learn to practice with the hindrances, different ways that we can learn to bring a wise attention to our getting to know, becoming familiar with, learning to befriend the hindrances in our daily life and in the cushion. And both are really relevant. I've gotten a lot of really good practice out of eyes open, moving around in the world, just noticing when the mind is hindered, right? Oh, when there's wanting. Oh, when my life right now is colored by wanting. And how to not need to get everything I want, but just to be very interested in the dynamic process that's playing out of the mind wanting and being convinced that if I get what I want, then I'll be happy, right? But there's never an end to that. So we can keep playing that out as long as we want to keep playing that out. But at some point, if we're interested in the spiritual practice of Dharma, then we want to start to notice these habits, the patterns that are playing, the processes that are at play. Mm-hmm. Gil Fronsdal sometimes talks about the hindrances with the language of the hindrances and their near neighbors, like you've heard that near neighbors with the Brahmavihara practices, metta, with loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. Right? And the hindrances have a kind of I like this, it's helped me, a near neighbor to them also. So if we do the tight and constricting thing and say, well, wanting is bad, I don't want to be a person who wants, I'm going to throw out all wanting, we're going to find ourselves in some painful places because there is a healthy kind of desire, right? A healthy kind of wanting. like the deep desire to live a healthy life and to be in relationship with other people, or, to take our practice into the world in useful ways. Those are really healthy desires, wholesome desires, we might say. And that's different. It's close, but it's not quite the hindrance. It's not the hindered version of desire, right? So even that word desire is a bit challenging. There's other words that are used, but desire is fine enough. Sensual desire is what the first hindrance is, right? It's that wanting for something. Like we can notice, like even the wanting to keep thinking, a more subtle form of wanting, or it can be a wanting of something, ice cream, right? Or whatever. It can be lust, something like that. So sensual desire, it's near neighbor, some healthy desires or healthy wishes for ourselves. And then we have the hindrance of ill will or hatred. And that's different than the near neighbor of a skillful averting, a skillful avoidance, a skillful kind of restraint. And that averting or avoidance, it comes without that the kind of tightness of ill will. Like there's no hostility there, right? It's like some wisdom that's arising, like, oh, let's not, right now is not the time for mindfulness of breathing practice, because every time I do mindful, like right now, I keep going back to the breath and all I feel is bearing down on it, right? So a skillful kind of averting might be, let's lighten it up, do a little more open awareness practice, let the mind relax, and then see what happens, right? That would be a skillful kind of averting, yeah, a skillful kind of avoiding right now, right? So those little instructions that I was giving early in the meditation about feel free to open your eyes, feel free to keep everything really accessible. It's building confidence in our practice, and the adjusting is really good, right? We have to be willing to adjust. So a skillful, so that we know the difference between aversion, or the aversion that comes with hostility or ill will, and the aversion that's healthy. Oh, we wouldn't even call it aversion here in the United States. Not a healthy aversion here in the United States. Usually it means, not good, not the skillful kind. But other words like averting or avoiding, healthy kind of avoiding, I think are more closer to what we're looking at. And then the third hindrance, the hindrance of sloth and torpor. So the first two are two sides of the same coin, right? The wanting, not wanting. And then the next two are two sides of the same coin, with the low energy states and the elevated energy states. So the low energy states of sloth and torpor, too little energy, right? Sluggish, dullness, that kind of thing. And then the restlessness and regret, or restlessness and worry, that too much energy. The energy is just bouncing around, right? Restless, not really landing anywhere. And so with sloth and torpor, their near neighbors are relaxation and stillness. Right? That tips into a kind of apathy or dullness, or I don't care, right? Not really, not really interested, not enough interest. Yeah. And then with restlessness and regret, the near neighbor would be some kind of vitality. So it's not, you might know people like this who just seem to have a lot of energy, right? A lot of energy for doing. And it just seems like that's just how they're built, right? Because that's true for some of us. We're just kind of built with a lot of energy. We have a lot of energy to move through our day, to do different things and to keep it moving. And, that's just fine. And then other people like me, we need a little bit more space in order to feel healthy, right? So different people have different proclivities. Yeah. So we want to know the difference so that we know, like, oh, I'm not just trying to copy what somebody else does. My nervous system needs a little bit of adjusting, right? Vitality, energy, motivation, can be the healthy qualities of restlessness and regret. And then, of course, when we're talking about doubt, doubt too has a healthy quality, right? Not all doubt is unskillful, but there's a healthy kind of discerning, right? A healthy kind of questioning, right? When we're in the middle of something that feels like I'm not really sure if this is the right relationship for me in this point in my life, there can be a healthy kind of questioning that's there, right? A healthy kind of doubt that helps us get ready to make decisions. So discernment brings with it a bit of wisdom, right? It's the active decision-making process. Sometimes this, at least in my experience, the kind of doubt that's healthy is a step before that. It's some questioning in the mind, right? So we don't want to throw all that away because it's useful to ask questions of ourselves. Like, what is, what is the right move now? What are the options here for me, right? So with sensual desire, the first of the 5 hindrances, these examples that Lee gives from the suttas, and the Buddha offers like 2 different. Did you read this article? Show me if anybody read it yet. Yeah, okay. Few. Great. So in the scriptures, there are two different sets of illustrations that the Buddha offers that Lee goes over in this chapter. And one of them, he talks about, he uses an analogy of a bowl of water to describe each of the hindrances, right? So like the first one was sensual desire. You like this analogy? With sensual desire, the Buddha uses the analogy of a colored bowl of water, like with multiple dyes in it. And they're all of them, it's like you can't see the depth of the water, right? Because there's something going on with the water, right? So the first one, sensual desire, what's going on with the water is the water's colored. So we can't see the depth of the water because we're very interested in the coloring of the water, right? And the mixing of the colors of the water, right? But the important part is that, yes, that the analogies are good and they make sense, but you can't see the depth of the water, right? You don't see more than what's on the surface. And what's on the surface is the color of the water in this case, right? So you don't see the processes. We don't notice that the mind is a dynamic set of processes. We don't notice that the mind is colored by wanting, right? We just see the object that we want, right? And there's a me that needs to get it. And the other way that I'll just go through each of the hindrances and I'll talk a little bit about the way the Buddha described them. And the other way is by talking, for the first one, is talking about debt. And I have to admit, I always have to think about this one because it confuses me a little bit. Maybe it doesn't to you. But the Buddha compares the wanting sense pleasures to being in debt. So he says, suppose a man were to take a loan and apply it to his business, and his business were to succeed so that he could pay back his old debts and would have enough money left over to maintain a family. He would reflect on this, and as a result, he would become glad and experience joy. So here's what Lee says. If you are in debt, you must continually work to pay back the debt. You can't simply call up the bank and say, well, I'm going to Spain on vacation this month and I'm going to make a payment. I hope that's okay with you. You can't call them up and say, I lost my job. I can't make a payment this month. I hope that's okay. So in the same way with our sense pleasures, no sense pleasure is ultimately satisfying, right? It's never gonna It's never going to ultimately deliver the goods. If you get something that you really like, you simply want to keep it, repeat it, or get something similar to it. You keep going in debt. Right? And for each of these hindrances, then the Buddha offers ways in which we practice. And largely, it's like cultivating its opposite. Yeah. Well, it's learning to practice with its opposite. So this is where this one gets a little bit tricky, I think, for us in the West, which Lee points to this in his chapter as well. But how the Buddha recommended, like in a particular context at a particular time, in ancient India, that we would practice like noticing everything, noticing what's unattractive, especially about the body. So sending people, if there's a lot of lust in the mind, then sending people to practice to go do sitting meditation at the charnel grounds, right? And charnel grounds were like where bodies were rotting and where they were being eaten by animals, right? So it's people who didn't have enough money for a different burial, then the bodies, as I understand it, would be delivered there. Yeah. So you're cultivating, you're like, diminishing the quality of lust. You're learning to not feed that quality of lust by noticing what's really unattractive about the body, for example. Now, here in the United States, we have a bit of different relationship to experience. Yeah. And I know for me, that's not always the right medicine. So knowing ourselves, being able to adjust is really useful. Sometimes knowing that, like it's enough, for example, if there's wanting in the mind or an unhealthy kind of wanting desire, then to kind of play that out in my mind, to think it through, like, is this going to lead to the outcome that I want is enough. I don't have to go to that extreme. It's just enough to kind of play that out. Like, what's the downside of this? Yeah. So that's a kind of adaptation that we might have here in the West. So ill will. The analogy that the Buddha uses to illustrate ill will is a bowl of boiling water. You can't see the depth because things are really churned up, right? You can't see the depth. You don't notice the processes of the mind. You don't notice that the mind is colored by ill will, by hatred, by aversion, right? Because that energy is it's active. If you've been angry before, I have been angry before. And I know how this feels. It's really hard. Like the anger, it feels enlivening, right? And it's hard to uncouple the experience of anger from the self-righteousness of anger. So I am convinced that I need to do something about this anger, right? And usually that anger, that doing something comes out of my mouth, right? The aversion comes out of my mouth. Like that's the doing something, yeah? And I can be really convinced that what's happening is skillful and it's like can't see the processes, can't see the nature of anger because there's too much bubbling at the surface, right? And the Buddha says this, suppose a man were to become sick. These are all gendered. I didn't remove all the genders, but I'm going to try again. Suppose a person were to become sick, afflicted, gravely ill, so that they could not enjoy their food and their strength were to decline. Then after some time, they would recover from the illness and soon would enjoy their food again and regain their bodily strength. They would reflect on this, and as a result, they would become glad and experience joy. So Lee, the Buddha also compares ill will and hatred to, when you are overcome with ill will, it's very much like being physically ill. You don't feel well, you can't think straight, you're hot, right? You can't really do what you want to do. You can't act out your deepest intentions because you're, just like I was trying to illustrate, the anger has convinced, even though there's anger, I'm a bit convinced that I still have something to say that needs to be said, but I don't really notice that it's the anger that's actually moving through the words. Right? So this is I like this little description. There's a Brahmin that comes to see the Buddha, and he's very upset because his younger brother had a few days earlier decided to become a monk with the Buddha. And so the Brahmin insulted and cursed the Buddha with rude, harsh words. The Buddha then replied, "Do friends and colleagues, relatives and kinsmen come to you as guests?" "Yes, certainly they do," the Brahmin said. "Do you serve them with staple and non-staple foods and delicacies?" "Well, of course, I prepare nice food for my guests." "And if they don't accept them, to whom do those foods belong?" "If they don't accept them, those foods are all mine." "Just so, Brahmin, I'm not accepting the harsh words you offered." Right? In other words, the Buddha didn't take on the anger that the Brahmin was expressing towards him, right? So that's, part of how we practice with that. I wanted to read something else about practicing with anger. Again, something I read on Sunday morning, but I love this. It's from Thich Nhat Hanh. It's called, from his book, Anger, Wisdom for Cooling the Flames. Anger's tricky. I think we can use a lot of help with this, especially now. Thich Nhat Hanh says, there are so many other there are so many other non-self elements that you can touch and recognize within yourself. Your ancestors, the earth, the sun, water, air, all the foods you eat, and much more. It may seem like these things are separate from you, but without them, you could not live. Suppose two warring parties were to negotiate and both sides do not know enough about themselves. You have to really know yourself, your country, your party, your situation, in order to understand the other's party, the other's nation, the other's people. Self and others are not two separate things because the suffering, hope, and anger of both sides is very much the same. When we get angry, we suffer. If you really understand that, you will be able to understand that when the other person is angry, it means they are suffering. When someone insults you or behaves violent towards you, you have to be intelligent enough to see that the person suffers from their own violence and anger. But we tend to forget. We think that we are the only one that suffers, and the other person is our oppressor. That is enough to make anger arise and to strengthen our desire to punish. We want to punish the other person because we suffer. Then we have anger in us. We have violence in us, just as they do. When we see that our suffering and anger are no different from their suffering and anger, we will behave more compassionately. So understanding the other is understanding ourselves, and understanding ourselves is understanding the other person. Everything must begin with you. To understand ourselves, we must learn and practice the way of non-duality. We should not fight our anger because anger is ourself, a part of ourself. Anger is of an organic nature like love. We have to take good care of anger, and because it is an organic entity, an organic phenomenon, it is possible to transform it into another organic entity. The garbage can be transformed back into compost, into lettuce and cucumber. So don't despise your anger, don't fight your anger, and don't suppress your anger. Learn the tender way of taking care of your anger and transform it into the energy of understanding and compassion. So good. It's just what the Buddha is talking about, right? Just illustrated differently. And from Thich Nhat Hanh, who is amazing, right? Especially given all that he went through in his life. peace activist for very good reasons. So it feels like a very trustworthy resource to hear someone like that talk about anger in this way is really compelling to me. And what the Buddha pointed to is like, we have to learn how to wisely attend to our anger. And that's not by demanding that it not be there, but it's learning to take care of it, right? Not being afraid to let it pop, but also not acting it out, having some restraint, some healthy kind of restraint, right? Anger is one of the forms of the hindrance of ill will or the hindrance of aversion. And there's another sutta that you probably know in the simile of the saw, in which the Buddha is talking about wise speech here. And he made this big statement. He said that, like, basically, you should never, there's never a good reason for hatred, for ill will. It's never a good reason, no matter what's happening. He just keeps going on and on about it, right? He's not playing around here. I had a friend once we were having a little conversation, a good Dharma friend, and they told me that a family member, when they were younger, they grew up Buddhist. When they were younger, they had a family member that used to be quite mean to them. And so they learned memorized the simile of the saw when they were younger. Like, they're not real young, but I think like in their teens or early 20s. And when they were talking to this family member, they would just recite the simile of the saw in their mind, right? Not necessarily because because they believed it word for word, because it made them laugh, right? And that helped them relate better to the moment that they were having with this family member and their own experience of being frustrated by it, right? So that kind of creativity and adaptability was really useful. So I'll read what the Buddha said in the simile of the saw. He said, "Monks, even if bandits were to carve you up savagely, limb by limb, with a two-handled saw, they among you who let their heart get angered even at that would not be doing my bidding. Even then, you should train yourselves. Our minds will be unaffected and we will say no evil words. We will remain sympathetic with the mind of goodwill and no inner hate. We will keep pervading these people with an awareness imbued with goodwill. And beginning with them, we will keep pervading the all-encompassing word with an awareness imbued with goodwill, abundant, expansive, immeasurable, free from hostility and free from ill will. And that's how you should train yourself." That's what Thich Nhat Hanh is saying. Like, we need to imagine that anger is just a dynamic, hindered quality of mind, not personal to you. It's a quality that everybody experiences. And when we practice with it enough, we get enough repetitions, that sense of that quality of wanting to take it personally, it gets a little bit thinner. And what peeks through is this capacity to see that the mind is actually hindered by anger, right? A very impersonal experience. Yeah. And we begin to have a little more compassion for each other, right? It doesn't mean that we just kind of lay back and take it, right? It might mean that we do some healthy adapting to that experience, right? Maybe making ourselves laugh internally, or maybe finding some distance from that experience if we can, right? And sometimes we might be able to stand up right in the middle of it and keep our ground for the good of our own well-being and for the good of others' well-being, right? There might be a capacity to be right there in the middle of what feels like tipping in the direction of anger and actually feeling it from others, and to stay there with it, right? And learn how to, if the situation calls for that, right? So for example, like an argument between you and a loved one, there's enough trust there, right? For you to feel it, to know that this is going to be okay, and to see if the conversation can continue even with this big energy in the room. Does that make sense? Don't walk away and say, "Shelly says that I should just get shot by arrows all day long." It's not what I'm saying. Yeah. 'Cause, 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 So sloth and torpor. I like this analogy of a stagnant bowl in water, a bowl of water that's stagnant, and slimy and gross, right? You just can't see, you can't see the depth because all of the whatever is there. I emptied a bowl of water like that today. And this is an evocative analogy that he uses here. I can find it. So the Buddha compares sloth and torpor to being in prison. Suppose a person were locked up in a prison, and after some time they would be released from prison, safe and secure with no loss of their possessions. They would reflect on this, and as a result, they would become glad and experience joy. And Lee says, if you're a prisoner, you can't do anything. You just sit there missing out on all the good things of life. If you are overcome with sloth and torpor, you can't do anything. You just sit there, not able to be concentrated, not able to gain any insight, not able to follow the spiritual path. It feels heavy in that way. So restlessness, regret. The analogy is a small bowl of water with a strong wind blowing the water, right? So the bowl is small, the container's tight, and the strong wind prevents you from seeing the bottom of it, seeing the depth. You can't see the depth. Another evocative analogy here. Suppose a person were a slave without independence, subservient to others, unable to go where they want. And after some time, they would be released from slavery and gain their independence. They would no longer be subservient to others, but a free person able to go where they want. They would reflect on this, and as a result, would become glad and experience joy. And Lee says, if you are overcome with restlessness and remorse, you are unable to do what you want. You're unable to help them. You're unable to support the settling of the mind. There's a lot of activity, physically, mentally, a lot of energy. The Buddha used like the analogy of a big pasture. When the mind is restless, it can be the wrong medicine to try to pin the mind, to try to pin it down, to force it to be still, right? But what's useful is to imagine like just letting that restlessness pop by expanding the mind enough to just let it be what it is, right? You've probably noticed this if you've experienced restlessness and you try to force something on the mind in that moment, it's like tension on top of tension. Have you noticed that? But you have to relax, you have to breathe, you have to, imagine, I literally sometimes imagine the pasture being really wide, like very expansive, just to give the restlessness, to befriend the restlessness and give it enough space to move. And then the last one is the experience of doubt, or hindrance of doubt. And for this one, the Buddha describes doubt a little bit differently. So he responds a little bit differently. Doubt itself is about overthinking, right? It can often the way we recognize doubt is because we're often swept away by doubt. We're caught up in the mind that's overthinking something, right? Do you know that? Or is that just me? Overthinking, I'm good at that. This mind is good at that. Yeah. And sometimes I'm convinced that the mind is making a decision, that this is useful, that I need to keep thinking this. But what's happening is just playing over information that I already know without going anywhere. It's not incorporating anything new. Sometimes it's replaying the same exact thing as if there's going to be a new insight that arises from that, right? That's where the crazy making power of doubt, because we can be convinced that we need to keep doing it, right? And so to notice the mind's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, in even very small ways can be really useful, because we're starting to get familiar with the experience of doubt, right? So the Buddha said that in order to work with doubt, like we have to learn to understand the difference between what's skillful and unskillful, what's blameworthy and blameless. These are some of what he teaches here. What's inferior and superior, right? What kind of thinking is leading me in a skillful direction, and what kind of thinking is leading me in an unskillful direction, right? What kind of thinking is beneficial thinking? We have to think. The mind is going to think. We need to make decisions, right? We need to be functional. The mind is going to need to do that. But we want to know, it's like, do I need to do this now? Is it skillful now? Timing is important, right? Is this a useful kind of thinking? Is it thinking that's aligned with noticing with spiritual practice? Or is it thinking that's really aligned with some kind of constrictedness, some polarizing? Am I just thinking about why I'm right? You know, am I flipping back and forth of all the options why somebody should think I'm right or why I should think I'm right? Am I proving myself? Right now, it's unskillful thinking, right? But is there a kind of wholesome analysis happening in the mind right now that feels useful to understanding something a little bit deeper? It might be what we call skillful thinking, right? So we want to understand something. So that's what the Buddha said, um, the way to practice wisely with doubt is to be really interested in what's skillful and unskillful, right? So that we start to know what we want to feed and what we don't want to feed. And to speak a little bit more about attending wisely, right? Sometimes, like that with sensual desire, reflecting on the downside of something can be a way of practicing, of getting out of the pattern of wanting, right? By reflecting on its downside. And sometimes with aversion, it feels really hard to get out of the pattern of aversion, right? And what's useful is no matter what we do, like a pain in the knee is a pain in the knee. And every time I notice the pain in the knee, the mind just hates it. Can't stand, doesn't really have the wisdom, the clarity to work with it. So it quickly keeps tipping back into aversion, right? And in that case, the right move is to skillfully avert the knee and practice some metta, right? Can be really a skillful way to do it. Sometimes we don't need to go to metta. Sometimes it's just enough to direct the attention somewhere else. But the Buddha talked about metta as a way of practicing wisely with aversion. Example. And the way to practice wisely, attend wisely to sloth and torpor, perhaps sometimes is not to just keep watching ourselves fall into a I don't care, apathetic, dull mind state, but to raise the energy in some way, right? By taking some initiative or expressing some persistence, like noting practice can be useful in this way. It raises the energy, it gives the mind something to do. Even practicing metta with phrases can be that, giving the mind something to do, taking some initiative to raise the energy in some way, right? And sometimes just noticing what's beneath that can be a way of like, oh, what's happening here, right? Asking that questioning can be a way of raising the energy too. And a way to explore, with questions can be useful in practice. Sometimes the question of especially as we get to know ourselves, we'll learn that we specialize in one or more of the hindrances more than others, right? I definitely know that about myself. But it's not a problem because we're just starting to know the tendencies of this mind, right? And what their habits are. Those habits came from somewhere. They're not personal. They're just expressions of nature. And everybody specializes in one or two more than others, right? Some of you know that, like I tend to have a lot of wants, or I tend to have a lot of not wants, right? Or this mind tends to be confused a lot of the time. It spins in doubt, right? Or I tend to cope with life by zoning out, by going apathetic, by going dull. Or I tend to cope with life by getting angry, by having a little fighty energy, right? You might specialize in that. So the more we get to know ourselves, right, we can start to ask questions that are useful. Like what else, what does this cover over? Maybe there's a need there that it covers over. Like sensual desire can cover over a sense of loneliness. Like the mind covers over that sense of loneliness by wanting something, right? A sense of aloneness even, or boredom. Like I know, I don't really want to deal with this. So there's got to be something around here for me to want. And ill will can cover over a sense of hurt. If you've ever had an argument with someone, you know this, like it can be quite instinctive. Somebody, you feel hurt, instead of practicing with that hurt, because we don't have a lot of reps in doing that. It's not what comes up. It's not the survival or the coping mechanism that's most prominent often, is to just be with it. It's a learned skill that we learn that from Buddhist meditation practice, right? But what often comes natural is I'm hurt, I hurt back, right? And instead of feeling the hurt and working with it, I immediately do something else to hurt someone, right? So that ill will can cover over the sense of hurt that's here that we really don't want to deal with. So the hindrances, hopefully that points out that the hindrances, it takes some steadiness of mind. And we learn, and although daily life practice might be accessible, it's also a place where it's quite charged and the stakes are high, right? Because the potential for transgression is great in daily life. When we're in a retreat container, things are a little bit more contained for us, right? And with sloth and torpor, or Gil Fronsdal calls sloth rigidity. It's kind of, which I like that actually, rigidity of like just going, trying to be absent in a rigid way, right? That dullness or that backward motion out of life, right, is a move towards more rigidity, not stepping into the dynamic flow of life with all of its mystery and all of its uncertainty and all of its vulnerability, right? There's a kind of pulling back from that. And sloth and torpor are sometimes strategies of the mind to shut down, right? Covers over disappointment or discouragement. It can be a sign of not wanting to be in the world. And restlessness and regret can offer cover over facing difficulty, right? Being real. We don't want to be with this. I don't want to be with this. I notice this quite a lot when there's restlessness. It's like, oh, I don't really want to be with something that's here, maybe some emotional state that's here, right? Or the imprint of some bad decision. Sometimes that's hard. The precepts precede this study of the hindrances, because when we clean our lives up a bit, it becomes a lot easier to settle down. There's less restlessness there. There's less need for restlessness there. Doesn't mean that there's no restlessness. There's restlessness for everybody, right? But when we feel good about the way that we're living, sometimes there can be a little bit less need to try to get away, distance ourselves from that. We are more willing to face difficulty because we understand something about it. And doubt can be an experience of being lost in indecision because we don't want to commit. Right? We don't want to have to make a decision. It's too scary to do that. We don't want to do that. Yeah. And maybe because we don't want to make a mistake. So sometimes we need a lot of reps with the hindrances in order to for the system to trust that it's okay to see what's deeper there. Right? So it's maybe not just, you might ask the question, what else is here or what's beneath this? And you might just start making things up. Right? But just to keep trusting that if it doesn't feel clear, it just doesn't feel clear right now. You'll get another opportunity to notice that hindrance again, and then we'll see, like, is it clear now? And no, still not clear. Okay. And at some point, with the willingness to meet experience as it is, you'll start to feel something that's beneath that, right? Oh yeah, look at that. Even beneath all this doubt is, I don't really want to be wrong. It's hard to commit. It's hard to step out there. Now I have to step fully into the unknown, and I have to accept all the karmic consequences for making this decision. I'd rather say, I don't know, right? That's easier because now I can avoid stepping fully into the middle of life, right? Rob Burbea calls the hindrances manifestations of our humanity, which I love because it's a shift in our relationship to them, from taking it personally, from condemning ourselves and each other. We just they're all in the soup here. They're manifestations of our collective humanity. And what's good to know is that unless we are willing to cultivate a new relationship to the hindrances, taking them personally only strengthens them, right? And we could, intellectually speaking, I could ask everybody and you'd all say, you don't want that, right? Often the hindrances are what brings you to practice in the first place, right? But it's hard to see them, and it's hard to learn how to cultivate a new relationship to them. But just that willingness, that steadiness, that willingness to keep adjusting and to let life keep expressing itself and just be willing to learn from that, both on the cushion and off the cushion. The repetitions, the continuity of awareness that comes with the repetitions is what helps us to build a new relationship, to cultivate a new relationship to the hindrances. Right. That's it. Let's just take a minute and sit together and let go of the words. Thanks, everybody, for your kind attention tonight. Hope there's something for you in there. Wishing you good learning in the days and weeks ahead. Mark will be back next week. If you have a minute to just say hello to someone before you leave, it's a really good way to build community. Zoomers, if you want to hang out for a minute and type in the chat, hello to one another, say where you're zooming in from. Be cool to do that. If you need to go, you can go. But get to know each other if you can take spare 2 or 3 minutes for that. Thanks.